Good evening. My name is Joan DiPiero, and I am the Community Engagement Specialist at College of DuPage. Thank you for attending the final installment in the Dialogue Over Distance Election Season series. Our presentation tonight, Coattails or Chasms, the local impact of the national election, features COD Political Science Associate Professor Melissa Mouritsen, COD Political Science Instructor William Enright, and Elmhurst University Political Science Professor Constance Mixon. Dr. Mouritsen recently authored More Blue, More Opposition, More Partisan in collaboration with University of Illinois Chicago faculty, which focuses on how local elected bodies vote and behave. In addition, she was recently featured on WGN-TV about the local impact of the election. Dr. Mouritsen has taught at Dominican University and Elmhurst University and is a former alderman's assistant and building and zoning consultant. Together with Dr. Mixon, she co-edited 21st Century Chicago, now in its third edition, which examines the major social, economic, political, and governmental challenges facing the Chicago metropolitan region. Dr. Mixon is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Urban Studies program at Elmhurst University. She has received the American Political Science Association's Phi Sigma Alpha Teaching Award and was named 2001 Illinois Professor of the Year by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Dr. Mixon frequently provides political analysis and commentary for local, national, and international media outlets, including the Chicago Sun-Times, Chicago Tribune, PBS, WGN, Fox, NBC, NPR, WBEZ, and WBBM. Joining us also is William Enright, an instructor of political science at College of DuPage, who has taught economics and international relations at the college. Prior to joining the faculty, Mr. Enright was the Director of Professional Learning at Illinois Institute of Technology, Rice Campus. He is currently President and Director of Operations for the Global Education Association in Glen Ellen, creating and managing international training programs. He is involved with local government and is a Glen Ellen Village trustee. Before we begin, I'd like to take a few housekeeping notes. All participants are muted with videos off. Please submit questions in the Q&A box. We ask that you be respectful in your questions and comments. This presentation will be recorded and can be found within 72 hours on the COD YouTube playlist, as well as archived on our website, www.cod.edu/experts. With that, I will hand it over to Dr. Mouritsen.
Thanks, Joan. So the impact of local elections, I think we've been talking about in DuPage for some time now, has been that DuPage is now pretty democratic. When we're looking at factors at the ground or factors at the national level, people are saying what is contributing, what national level sorts of patterns and behaviors are contributing to things going on at the local level, at the county level, at the municipal level that are changing the things that we're seeing. So that's been the big story for us in DuPage, at least the past 4 years, but I'm about to make the argument that it's been going on for the past 15 to 20 years. So first, I'd like to share with you guys some of the election results from November. So I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see sort of where we're at in DuPage County. DuPage County voted 58% for Joe Biden. People said, wow, DuPage County, I remember this county was so Republican and it voted 58% for Joe Biden. So something's changing, right? Must be Trump, the Trump effect. People didn't like Trump, so they voted for Joe Biden. Well, it turns out that DuPage County has been voting for the Democrat since about 2008. So no surprise there. Actually, what's surprising is the margin that 58% of DuPagers voted for the Democratic candidate. It's been trending upward for about the past 20 years. This margin is much larger than in 2016, but in 2016, DuPage County did go for Hillary Clinton. Dick Durbin won the Senate. Mark Curran ran against him. What's notable here, though, is that Curran did get 40% of the vote, so there still is a strong Republican presence in DuPage. We shouldn't discount that. But again, since about 2008, 2010, DuPage County has been voting for the Democratic candidate for Senate. In the 6th and the 8th congressional districts, which are the largest chunks of DuPage County, certainly the 5th and the 14th also touch DuPage County, but these are the two biggest ones. They also had Democratic candidates who won election. Kasten and Krishnamurthy both won re-election. So DuPage County has voted 100% at the federal level for Democratic candidates. This is something that 20 years ago, you would never hear someone say, right? So very interesting at the federal level. We're seeing this at the state level as well. So if we look at the statewide results for the districts, these are the districts that lie wholly inside of DuPage County. Now, again, because of the way districts are drawn, there's probably 10 more districts that slice out a chunk of DuPage County or call part of DuPage County their district. These are the districts, again, who are wholly inside of DuPage County. So these 7 districts, again, 20 years ago, pretty Republican, almost all Republican. Now, what we see, so I've color coded them. The office, if it's in blue, it's a Democrat now. If it's in red, it's a Republican now. The majority are Democrats. The 41st House District was flipped. A Democrat beat Grant Worley, who used to be on the DuPage County Board. And we, again, a majority of House seats. What's notable, however, is that in the 45th district, we had a Democrat who won 2 years ago, who flipped a very Republican district, who did not win re-election. So again, the Republican presence is not, it's still there. The Republicans aren't gone, they're still in DuPage County. But by and large, we're seeing Democratic gains remain in these state seats. So 4 Democratic and 3 Republican districts. This is the same as the majority that they had in 2018. So what's the story at the county board level? Same story at the federal and the state level, which is that the Democrats are picking up seats like crazy. I think that's the official political science term for what's going on in the DuPage County Board, is that the Democrats are picking up a ton of seats. For the first time since the 1930s, the Democrats have a majority on the DuPage County Board. Again, this is something in the 1990s when Lee Daniels and Pate Phillips were controlling the state house, 2 major players in the Republican Party that were from DuPage County. You would never be able to fathom these sorts of results in 2020. What happened on the county board is 6 seats were up and 4 of those seats were won by Democrats. And that's what pushed the majority over, right? So now we have 11 Democrats on the board and 7 Republicans. Again, unheard of. They just selected a vice chair. And so the vice chair of the DuPage County Board is a Democrat, which is interesting because the board chairman is a countywide elected position and he is a Republican. So some interesting dynamics there. Other countywide offices, we have 6 new Democrats who were elected, brand new, Democrats that had never been in these positions before. So the Democrats worked really hard to pick up seats in DuPage County. Where did these Democrats come from? That's the other thing sort of that we're thinking about, we're trying to figure out when we're thinking about the local effect. In 2018, there was a common refrain, particularly among DuPage County Democrats, where they said, blue wave, a blue wave washed over DuPage County. And it was this effect of Donald Trump. People hated Donald Trump, his antics, his rhetoric. And so Republicans were like, enough is enough. We are not like that. And there's some truth to that, right? DuPage County Republicans tend to be more moderate, more policy oriented and focused. They tend to be pro-union, pro-public education. Whereas Trump's policies tend to be more nationalistic. They tend to be a sort of a hodgepodge. So we did see some of that. Also, Democrats who maybe hadn't voted or hadn't participated got pissed and participated and voted in large numbers in 2018. But a bigger, really a bigger and a much better, a more satisfying explanation is what we call in political science a secular shift. And really the demographics of DuPage County are changing. DuPage County is just becoming more democratic. There are more democratic people who live in DuPage County. Part of that is that people who live in inner suburbs are moving out to DuPage County. So people who live in suburban Cook, for instance, are moving to DuPage County. The same reasons that people moved from the city to the suburbs 50, 75 years ago. People are moving from the inner suburbs to the outer rung suburbs, better schools, cheaper housing, bigger yards, things like that. Also, as the people who live in DuPage have kids, their kids are getting older, their kids tend to vote Democratic. We see more union activity. Unions tend to vote Democratic. So the traditional support of the Democratic Party just has more of a presence, right, in DuPage County. So again, that's what we call a secular shift or a demographic shift. I put mobilization of New Democrats down there a second time because as these New Democrats move, right, from suburban Cook or whatever Democratic areas that they're coming from, you need to mobilize them as well. And so the secular shift, people can move, Democrats can move, but if the party is not taking advantage and if the candidates themselves are not taking advantage, it's not going to make one bit of difference. And this is something that Democrats in DuPage County have been very good at doing. They've been very good at mobilizing, whether it's because of Trump or whether it's because of new people living inside of DuPage County. Their ground game has been excellent, especially in the past 4 years. They've been able to find avenues and find offices. Who knows what the auditor does? Does anyone know what the Forest Preserve District? These are offices that people tend to overlook, but the Democrats said, we're going to try those seats. We're going to try those races. We're going to find good, solid people who are good at their jobs or who are committed to those positions, and we're going to run people in those seats. So they had a super strong ground game. So the local aspect, I guess, to go back to the beginning, which is the sort of the local effect or the coattails. I would argue a little bit that the jury is still out on whether it's a coattail effect. However, that local aspect of it, the ground game, the individual effort was more important than ever in this election, especially in DuPage County. The true local effect, we will find out on April 6th, right? So when the offices that I'm mentioning now are state and county offices, but your city governments, right, your mayors and your trustees and your park district and your forest preserve, all of these elections are happening April 6th of next year. What will the effect of November be on those elections? We are seeing some of it because if you want to run in April, you have to file your paperwork to run starting yesterday. And DuPage County saw 40 people line up yesterday to run for offices like school board and trustee. So we are seeing some more activity. We're seeing offices that haven't been challenged traditionally being challenged. So perhaps some of the let's call it excitement of the November elections has trickled down in a way that has caused people to want to run for offices that typically we don't think of, or maybe that they have forgotten of because they're in April. So it's generated some activity and some interest at the municipal level. I will stop there and I will hand it over to Connie. So I'm very suburban focused. I'm very DuPage focused, but we have forgotten here Chicago. So Connie is going to tell us about Chicago.
Of course, I was muted. Thank you very much, Missy. And, you know, and just adding to what you were saying about what's happening in DuPage County, we're seeing this in suburban regions across the country. So if you look at places like Atlanta or Dallas or Phoenix and some of the suburbs around there, Biden was able to make gains, particularly in highly educated suburbs. In fact, more than anything else, part of what we're seeing is education level is part of the one, you know, key dividing line in some of these votes. But we're seeing this transformation. I think you're exactly right in terms of the demographic shift that's happening with the wealthy. You know, what we talked about, you know, white flight of the 1950s or 1960s. We're almost seeing the reverse of that today with wealthy returning to cities, which is pushing poverty further out. And suburbs just look a whole heck of a lot different than they did in, you're famous for saying, you know, not my mother's suburb or my grandmother's suburb, right? That
not your mama's DuPage County.
Yep, that's exactly it. They're just all across the United States are looking significantly different than they did before. And so it looks like, Missy, I can't share my screen until you stop sharing yours. There we go. All right. All right. Is my screen showing?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. All right. And as Missy said, Missy and I have co-written or co-edited a book together along with Dick Simpson called 21st Century Chicago. And Missy focuses a lot on the suburban region, and I focus a little more on cities. But as somebody, you know, who studies urban politics, we can't talk necessarily about cities versus suburbs anymore. We have to think about entire metropolitan regions. So I think it's important to take a look at what happened in Chicago in the 2020 election. So what we know is overall in Chicago, Joe Biden won Chicago with over 82% of the vote. And not a big surprise, Chicago is a strong Democratic stronghold. He won every ward. Chicago has 50 wards. It's divided into geographical wards. And Biden won each of the wards with over 60% in every ward except for 3. And it's interesting to take a look at these 3 wards. In the 41st ward, and in fact, media in the days after the election were actually reporting that Trump had won the 41st ward. This 41st ward is up on the north side. I've got it circled in red. It includes the communities of Edison Park and goes out towards O'Hare. But as we know, as happened in states, the same thing happened in a lot of Chicago wards, whereas Republicans tended to vote in person, Democrats tended to vote by mail, and it took longer to tally the mail-in votes. And so on election night and for a couple days after, it did look like Trump was ahead in the 41st ward. But after all votes were counted, and these are the official numbers, Biden narrowly squeaked by in the 41st ward. And the 41st, like the 38th, which, you know, almost shares a border with the 41st, and then down on the far southwest side in the 19th ward, the areas of Beverly, but importantly Mount Greenwood, are home to a lot of police and firefighters. And we know that there have been divides, partisan divides, when it has come to social justice issues. Trump has talked a lot about law and order, which has appealed to law enforcement officers. The president of the Chicago Police Officer Union has been quite supportive of President Trump, quite vocal, has attended White House events. And so I think that had an influence in the 41st, the 38th, and the 19th ward, which these are areas of the city where city workers are required to, you know, due to the residency requirement, are required to live in the city. So they tend to be populated by police officers, firefighters, and teachers. So this was the city of Chicago. If we looked, so Biden won the city of Chicago with over 82% of the vote. And when we tease out suburban Cook County and look at suburban Cook County on its own, Biden, it was, his lead reduced a little bit, but he still won with over 66% of the vote. And I should point out, since I circled it, the 21st ward on the south side, that ward went most heavily for Biden, with 96% of the vote going to Biden. This is a heavily populated African-American neighborhood that was also very hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the lack of a national response to the pandemic, I think, played a role, particularly in Black and brown communities in the city of Chicago and throughout our metropolitan region. So if we want to think about Joe Biden's coattails and what that meant down ballot, I took a look at, there weren't a whole heck of a lot of races at the local level this time. We'll see more next year in Chicago. We'll see in 2023. But the Cook County State's Attorney race was something that flooded our airwaves, our television airwaves, our social media for months on end. And it was between Kim Foxx and Patrick O'Brien. Kim Foxx was the incumbent Democrat. Patrick O'Brien was a Republican running for a Cook County seat. Cook County has always been very strongly Democrat, just like if we look back, 15 years ago, DuPage County, very strongly Republican. And the Republican O'Brien did a little better than I think most might have expected in a typical election. Of course, you had the Jussie Smollett case with Kim Foxx, and there's also throughout the United States, there has been a backlash, particularly to more progressive state's attorneys. And so we saw progressive Democrats challenged first in primary elections by more moderate Democrats, and then in general elections by Republicans. So we can see, and this particular slide includes all of Cook County, which is both the city and the surrounding suburban region of Cook County. And we can see that Biden had over 1.7 million votes. And you would think the coattails, we would see Kim Foxx having similar numbers. Now, voter turnout was significantly higher than it has been in the past in the city of Chicago. So that certainly helped Kim Foxx. But you can see the divide with, somewhere around 600,000 votes. They voted for Biden, but they didn't vote for Kim Foxx. And I looked deeper into some of this data, just looking at the city of Chicago. And when we look at how the city of Chicago voted for the Cook County State's Attorney, the Kim Foxx race, as opposed to the presidential race, we see similar trends. We see Biden having 82% of the vote, where Kim Foxx only had about 64% of the vote. And here, Donald Trump ends up with about, 16% of the vote in the city of Chicago. But Patrick O'Brien, the Republican running for state's attorney, ends up with close to 30% of the vote. And so this gets into a question about voters who are splitting their ticket. And I think we saw that throughout the United States. And this helps to also explain why Republicans overperformed their polls. So if we looked at polling prior to the election, we would have thought that Democrats would have had, it was going to be a blue wave throughout the United States, and Democrats would have been racking up wins over and over. And they were expected to take a lead of, up to 10 seats in the House, and they've lost those seats in the House. And so we're still, political scientists and data analysts are still flushing all of this out. But what seems to be the trend is something that Missy mentioned a little bit ago. In addition to just the demographic shifting, there does seem to be increased ticket splitting. So, if you'd ask me in 2006 or 2016 or 2012, how many people were splitting their ticket, I would say not so many. But what we're seeing in 2020 is people did split their ticket. So Republicans perhaps, didn't vote for Donald Trump. They voted for Biden, or they voted for a third-party candidate, but yet they still voted down ballot for the Republicans. So we see this as an example for the Cook County State's Attorney, but throughout, states that we're looking at, regardless of the state, we see where folks didn't vote for Donald Trump, but they continued to vote for the Republican state rep or their state senator and other offices down ballot. We see similar trends. This was something I was hugely interested in during this election, was the Fair Tax Amendment. And we see similar trends with the Fair Tax Amendment. The disparities. And I mean, part of this, I don't want to necessarily pinpoint this. I think there was a lot of media information out there that made people confused about what the fair tax actually did. And huge amounts of money spent on both sides that could have an influence on this. But we're also seeing similar trends, just looking at the city of Chicago. Over 82% voted for Biden, but only 71% voted yes for the fair tax. So are these coattails? Are they not coattails? To some extent, it's a little bit of both. To some extent they are, but that doesn't tell us the whole story. So thanks for including me and indulging me in my discussion of Chicago politics and Chicago elections. But as I said earlier, I do think that it is really important to talk about the metropolitan region as a whole and how they integrate. They're no longer separated. What's happening in Chicago affects DuPage County and vice versa. So thanks very much for including me, Missy.
Sure.
Can you hear me? This is Bill Enright.
Yes.
So, if any of my students were on this, they would be like, okay, I'm not surprised at all that he doesn't have the technology figured out. So it happens to me all the time, especially with Zoom things and stuff like that. So sorry about that. But I am glad to join in, glad to have a chance to talk a little bit about what's going on, especially in DuPage, because I actually live in Glen Ellen. And so I thought I'd just follow up with a couple of things that Connie and Missy talked about, which would, include some of the local elections we had in my district, which is the 4th district in DuPage County. It's the same geographical area if you do the Forest Preserve or you do the DuPage County Board. And so we had Elliott at DuPage County Board, who's a Republican, lose to LaPlante by a very close margin. It was just a couple hundred votes, but he was an incumbent and lost to, a challenger Democrat who I would say wasn't necessarily known really well around the community, but certainly as a Democrat, picking up any support that Biden had, in my opinion, a lot of people voting against the Republicans because of Trump in this area. And then at the same time, Garen's beating Whalen and another Republican incumbent being beat by a Democrat in the Forest Preserve District, which, again, not a lot of people necessarily know, who's running or much about what the Forest Preserve District has going on. But, I know Whalen for years, and certainly I know that he was passionate about the Forest Preserve. And, again, I think probably on Biden's coattails that Garris ended up winning that one too. And that district sort of includes Glen Ellen, Wheaton, Lombard, parts of Oak Brook Terrace, and looked like the place that had the biggest influence on it was Glendale Heights, where they really came out in large numbers, much larger numbers this year than they did even 2 years ago to vote, and really had a big impact on those two races. And so, when you're looking at what's taking place in DuPage County, for sure, there's some sort of coattails thing going on, and probably some sort of anti-Trump vote taking place there. And then, also we've got the state reps and state senators from DuPage County that the Democrats did really well with. I'm not so sure like how it's going to all play out in the next couple of years with the problems that Madigan's looks like he's going to have. And, we're only going to hear about Madigan on any commercial that's coming out in 2 years from now about what Madigan did to the state and everything that's taken place with these corruption charges that are up against him. And so I'm sort of like interested to see how that plays out. But for sure, again, like as Missy pointed out, the Democrats continue to pick up seats in DuPage County at the state House and Senate level. Now, of course, their issue is they don't have anybody else to blame because they've got control of the House and the Senate and the governor's office. And of course, they were hoping, as Kenny pointed out, the fair tax would go through and they might be able to bring in a little bit of extra tax revenue, and that's not going to happen. And now, of course, with COVID and the shortfalls in the budget, which I heard today it was around $4 billion, which would be about 10% of the budget that we have a shortfall in. And if you've been watching the negotiations in Congress, it doesn't sound like there's going to be any state and local assistance that's coming through, at least on the next package. And so I think that those are going to be, things that the Democrats are really going to have to deal with at the state level. And it's not like, in the next couple of months, it's going to get any better because we know that many businesses are closed down and you're not going to have that same tax revenue coming in that really helps to support the state. And then at that time, and then for that matter, also the local governments, which again, these guys were talking about. And I can tell you since I live in Glen Ellen and I'm on the village board in Glen Ellen, there's certainly a lot of things taking place there that are interesting. For instance, we do it a little bit different in Glen Ellen. We have this primary, and the primary is for this thing called the Betterment Party. And so people who are interested in running, they sort of sign up with the Betterment Party. And then if the Betterment Party, which is like just a group of local citizens, decide that you're qualified, then you put on the ballot. And so this year there were 12 people who ran on this Betterment Party for only 3 seats. And so in Glen Ellen, certainly it looks like there's a lot more interest in local politics. And there have been a few things taking place in Glen Ellen that have brought a lot of citizens out, including a new project in the downtown area that's going to allow for an apartment building that's 5 stories tall, which is normally only allowed to be 4 stories tall. And so that brought out a lot of citizens who are opposed to it. There was also marijuana as a referendum in Glen Ellen, which actually passed. And then just for anybody who's interested in watching a little bit of interesting drama to add to it, the village president, or equivalent to the mayor in Glen Ellen, announced last night that she's resigning at the end of the year, even though her term would go till May. And so that's adding a little bit of extra to the drama here. And then just one other final thing I would just want to talk about is certainly the big thing for national level is what's going to take place in Georgia and whether or not we're going to see a 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans pick up the Senate seats in Georgia. And, I would guess it might probably be split, but I'm just not very sure what direction things are going to go. And I can imagine if you're living in Georgia right now, the amount of television commercials that must be going on because everybody is pouring all the money into those races. And of course, if the Democrats can pick up 2, then they're going to control the Senate because Kamala Harris would be the vice president and she would break the tie in the Senate. So that's the one that everybody's going to be focused on in the next 3 or 4 weeks. And so, that's a little bit of the things that I've been sort of keeping an eye on. And I do agree that DuPage County has really gone Democrat, but also that some of these races at the county level have been really close to. And so I don't know if when we get to a midterm election, which I know we just had this one, they haven't even been sworn in. Well, I guess the county board has, but many of these people haven't even been sworn into office yet. But, when you do get to the midterm elections, certainly there is just about always backlash against the incumbent president. And I can tell you in 1994, when I was running for state representative, there was that was the time that the Republicans actually took control of all the statewide elected offices in Illinois, and that was Bill Clinton's. It was when Bill Clinton was president, and then also took control of the House and the Senate in Illinois. So it does happen from time to time. Anyway, I'm not sure from here if we're getting questions, but I'll try to give it back to one of you guys.
Well, Bill, I want to, so I guess I'll ask you the first question. The Coattails issue aside, I wonder, and so I've had conversations with people, if the drag wasn't necessarily Trump, but in some of these county races, if it was Jeannie Ives, because some of these Republicans campaigned with her and put big signs next to hers. And so I wondered if maybe campaigning with her or, didn't help them.
Yeah, right. And I can't necessarily disagree with that. And like you said, a lot of people had signs next to it. I know that Tim Elliott, the Republican who was running for 4th District, had signs next to her. Peter Breen, who was running for State House, also had the signs next to hers. And so, and then Peter Breen was running against Tara Costa Howard, the Democrat who's now was an incumbent because she beat him 2 years ago. But yeah, I have sort of heard some of that too. I don't know necessarily if that was enough, if Jeannie Ives was enough to turn that vote, but I think in DuPage County, and this is just my local, talking to people in Glen Ellen, is that especially the suburban professional women were out in large numbers to support the Democrats, which in the past hasn't necessarily happened.
Makes sense. I think, Joan, if you'd like, we can take questions.
Okay. Yeah, we have one question coming in right now. Missy and Bill, several of the DuPage County board races were won with razor-thin margins, LaPlante and Schwartz in particular. How might that impact making a policy and governing? And when will we start seeing policies start changing?
Sure. So Schwartz's wasn't as thin. It looked like it in the beginning, but LaPlante's was only 300. So I think Bill's point should be echoed. The thing is now, for a long time, there was one Democrat, right, on the DuPage County board, and she sort of was the voice of opposition, and then more Democrats were elected. So it was 7 Democrats, 11 Republicans. They did not vote as a cohesive bloc, right? Some of them voted more with Republicans actually than they did with Democrats. So we shouldn't mistake the title Democrat, for same policy. However, now they have an overwhelming majority, right? Now there's 11 Democrats and 7 Republicans. Now they have to present a platform and enact policy, right? And so aside from the razor thin margins, they have a job to do. And so Bill put it a little bit more bluntly, right? They have no one else to blame, but they have to do stuff and they have to produce. And after the remap, right? So after we get the census data, DuPage County will be drawn, the districts will be redrawn. And in 2022, all 18 of these are up again. So the razor thin margins, these are the people who will have to fight for their supper even harder than the other ones. So they have a tough re-election in 2 years, not in 4 years. And they have a platform that they have to build and enact and show results for in 2 years. So it's going to be tough.
Bill, would you like to add something? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and also on that side, I mean, I guess it is a partisan race, and I guess there is some differences in Republicans and Democrats, but you're also getting down to at these local levels, you're talking about, are you going to increase the tax for homeowners? And I think just about across the board, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, you don't want to increase taxes for homeowners. And I know the DuPage County Board has only over the last 12 years increased the tax on the new building rather than on CPI number. And so since they've been able to keep that down and still in my opinion, deliver all the services that you would expect out of the county. The Democrats generally join in on that too. They're not opposed to like trying to keep people's taxes down and not increase people's property taxes. And so I think like some of those issues are going to be pretty similar. When you get to maybe marijuana in DuPage County, that might have been more split along, the party lines. But even at that, first of all, for DuPage County, they're only talking about the unincorporated areas. And then, are they all going to be on the same page with like not having marijuana sales in the unincorporated areas? And if you are, then, you're also maybe passing up the sales tax opportunity from those regions. And so I'm not exactly sure if it's necessarily going to be as stark of a difference as you would maybe expect a lot of times, just because there's not as strictly partisan issues there.
That's a good point. That it's more the more local you get, the more managerial in nature government is. Connie and I had an advisor who used to say there's no Republican or Democratic way to take out the trash. So distinctions are a little bit harder to suss out.
Speaking of taxes, Connie, what were expectations on the tax issue, and were you surprised by the outcome? Is that dead, or will it be revived in the future?
Boy, I don't know that I saw any really good polling on that. I actually, based on the amount of money that was being spent opposing it, I guess I wasn't surprised that it ended up failing, because it needed 60% in order to go into effect as a constitutional amendment. And there were strong voices, and I think Bill picked up on this a little bit earlier when he talked about Madigan. I think that Republicans were quite successful in tying the fair tax to Madigan, tying it to corruption. And this also had an impact on the Illinois Supreme Court justice retention election. A U.S. Supreme Court justice has never lost a retention election before, and Kilbride, a Democrat, ended up losing that retention election, in part because of a lot of the same groups spending money opposing both the fair tax and Kilbride. And particularly the Kilbride retention election fell underneath the radar. But Republicans have been quite adept at strategizing and winning key legislative seats, and also trying to win more and more state judicial seats, and spending quite a bit of money backed by special interests to do so. Yeah, I think it's probably dead for now, David. That's not to say it wouldn't come back again, but yeah, I think it was pretty much a resounding no on that one. So I don't suspect it will come back soon. The hard part about this is that the state can already raise your taxes, and without federal money that Bill identified coming from the federal government to close some of the COVID gaps that have been spent by our state and local governments, we may very well see those tax increases, but now there'll be a flat tax applied to everybody.
Oh, yeah. And just if I could just follow up with that, just the one thing that I always thought was kind of interesting was in 2014, we had the referendum. It was an advisory referendum for the state of Illinois, whether or not we wanted to increase taxes on people. I think it was made over who were making over $500,000. It may have been for people making over $1 million, and it passed by a wide margin. As I recall, it was 65 to 35% that residents of the state of Illinois voted to increase those taxes. And at the same time, we also voted in Bruce Rauner, who said, well, I was never in favor of that at all, and I'm never going to go along with increasing taxes for the for those people who make over $1 million or $500,000. And so even though the people of Illinois voted yes for that referendum, they also voted for a governor who was opposed to it. So maybe they'll bring it back.
Thanks. Okay, we've got another question closing in on the pandemic issue. How did Governor Pritzker's handling of the pandemic affect local elections? Did it benefit one party over the other?
I'll go if nobody else wants to start.
I think that, yeah, you, Bill.
Oh, okay. Well, in my opinion, the way that it's sort of played out, and this is, I think maybe a little bit more noticeable in the suburbs, is that these the governor put in these orders, and then at least by now at this point, many of the local mayors and presidents of the towns are not even enforcing those rules. And so, for example, if you want to go out to eat or go to a bar in Glen Ellen, you can go to one because the rules are not being enforced in Glen Ellen. And so, as far as at least the governor's orders, that was something in the spring that everybody went along with and thought maybe, the pandemic would be over if we went along with these rules. Of course, we know that didn't necessarily happen. In the long run, we've gotten a lot worse. And so I think many of the local officials have basically said that they're not going to go along with that anymore. Now we know the Democrats did win pretty handily in many of these state races and the state house and Senate races. And so apparently that didn't play as much of a role. But I do think that at least for the local governments these days in DuPage County, at least, that they're not abiding by the rules of the governor and basically ignoring what he said. And I think that maybe a lot of citizens in those towns probably agree with them.
Yeah, I don't, that's a good point. I don't think it's party specific, actually. I think it depends. That sort of is exacerbating a split in the Democratic Party. It almost seems like between moderate or more corporate, the kids are calling corporate Democrats, and progressive Democrats. Because if you go to suburban Cook County municipalities that are 192% Democrat, there still are plenty who are keeping restaurants and bars open. Where I live in Berwyn, which is right next to the city, the mayor said he wasn't going to enforce the governor's orders, and he's a Democrat. He's a head of our Democratic committee, whatever, and he didn't enforce it. But it highlighted a split in the Democratic Party. So I don't think it was a Democrat-Republican thing. I think this is showing fractures and frays in many different ways.
Yeah, I would agree with all the above. I mean, there's been very vocal opposition, but I'm not sure how that falls or if it makes that much of a difference by party.
Yeah, and I would say it's not that he, necessarily did the wrong thing with trying to protect the citizens by closing the businesses, but we know that we did it, and we sort of took all the pain in the spring and thought that would pretty much be all we needed to do. And then when it came right back in the fall, and that in the towns are we're already bleeding from this, and our businesses are, about to collapse, and so we can't make them close anymore. And for Chicago, even worse, because they also had the protest that took place, and then the looting that took place, and businesses were closed for even a longer time there. And so you can only imagine how bad those businesses are doing in Chicago after this. And of course, that the mayor is enforcing those rules in Chicago compared to the suburban locations.
I mean, I just might add that had we stayed shut down a little bit longer in the spring, as was recommended, that we would look a lot more like Europe and we could have more of our businesses open. But because we closed early, and even things as simple as mask wearing have become partisan, that's part of the reason why we find ourselves where we are. There certainly would have been, by all the science tells us, there would have been another surge in the fall, but lacking any sort of national leadership in response to COVID-19, I think that has dramatically impacted us. I don't think it had to be a binary choice between the economy and public health. I think there was a way to manage both, and lacking national leadership, that just didn't happen.
Looking back on this election, it's going to be pretty interesting when 20 years from now, it was a pandemic that won the election or lost the election for whoever. But we do have someone who's talking about how we used to be able to vote a straight party ticket by just pressing a button. If you remember that many years ago, okay? Now to vote straight, one needs to vote for every candidate separately. Do you think this has made an impact on ballot splitting?
Oh, for sure. The very first year I could vote in 1996 was the last year I think that they had that in Illinois. That was the last year I think they had straight ticket voting. Yeah, because you're forced to, you're compelled to. But I think what it's also done is caused a lot more of the down ballot offices to be skipped at the end because you can't just punch whatever for Republican or whatever for Democrat. It's actually probably hurt some of the down ballot tickets or down ballot offices as well.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree. I can remember my grandfather and uncle who were Chicago precinct captains wanting to make sure that everybody voted the daily straight ticket. Yeah, I think what's happened is people don't vote down ballot. They may split some of the top races, but it just means that less people are voting down ballot.
Oh, so your grandfather and father were precinct captains in Chicago?
My grandfather and my uncle.
And your uncle? So did they work for the city or the county?
Of course they worked for the city. They had nice city jobs.
Nice city jobs. And then they were expected to get out the vote, and they knew everybody in the neighborhood to go talk to get the vote out.
Yep. And this was under the first Richard J. Daley administration. So correct. They did not keep their city jobs if they did not turn out the vote in their precinct.
And 5 minutes late, and 5 minutes after you walked out, they knew who you voted for too. I remember that, but that's another story for another time.
Yeah, that was certainly interesting. And I mean, even still today, if you take a look at Chicago, there's still a lot of precinct captains that work for the county or the city or the state, and are certainly responsible for getting the jobs out, like around Midway Airport, where Mike Madigan's district is.
I have another question here for all participants. What should we look for in the April elections? Do you think there'll be a turnout increase? Will the turnout increase filter down to those?
Turnout for local elections is very poor, unfortunately, somewhere around 15%. If we're lucky, sometimes as low as 10%. Suburban Cook does better when there is a city election, because sometimes the excitement of a new Chicago mayor, we get excited too because our neighbors are voting for somebody. But unfortunately, it doesn't ever seem to go above 15%. Will November change that? I mean, it's really hard to say. It's a more general question, I suppose, of what mobilizes voters. I think people are so tired after, especially the past 4 years. It's really hard to say. I don't know, maybe my co-panelists are more optimistic.
Yeah, I would say a lot's going to depend on how they vote. So the state and counties and local governments, they very quickly enacted legislation for mail-in voting, but that was a one-shot and done deal. It doesn't extend beyond that. So they're going to have to, quickly figure things out. By all the way things look is that we're not going to be safe. We may not be safe yet for in-person voting. And what we found out is that a lot of voters became familiar and comfortable with the process of mail-in voting, which increased voter turnout. So I expect that the number of people who choose to vote by mail, if available, will continue to do so. And that may overall help voter turnout in general. So that's something I'd be keeping my eyes on, is what your local municipality is doing about what kind of rules they're setting for how citizens can vote in April.
Yeah, and then as far as, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Bill.
I was just going to say, as far as the voter turnout goes, at 15%, and that's like nobody young who's in those numbers. It's primarily senior citizens that show up, maybe people who have kids in school who are worried about what's going on in their school district or the park district, but primarily it's older voters who show up to vote in those. And then for those who might have a referendum at that time, whether or not they want to have a bond issue to build a new school or to do something with a park district, those can be controversial. So more locally, you might get a group out. And then, as I mentioned in Glen Ellen, in actuality, in that primary that we had with the Civic Betterment Party. And by the way, it was 1 week after the election, after the November 3rd election, we had this primary. And surprisingly, 1,600 people showed up for it, which normally there's about 600 people that show up for it. So there was like huge voter turnout. And it's probably because there's like some pretty controversial issues in Glen Ellen, including, as I mentioned, like this new taller building in downtown. So the more localized things, it can often depend on like if there's any big issues taking place there. Sorry, Missy, go ahead.
No, it's a good point. In 2019, the Hinsdale School District, the high school, had a referendum because they wanted to build a pool. And so that drove up turnout like crazy. So they had much better numbers than everybody else. I think to Connie's point about the mail-in, for municipalities that choose not to do early voting, that has the potential to help people, but also to maybe exacerbate disparities for communities that tend not to have access to voting anyway. You have to know that you can do a mail-in ballot, and you have to know how to get that mail-in ballot. So if you don't have good literacy, or if you don't speak English, or if you don't have access to the internet, or these sorts of things, and some municipalities, the municipality I live in, chose not to do early voting. We had to go to Cicero if we wanted to do early voting, and that's a way to disenfranchise people as well. It's a way to get people not to vote. So now for the municipals, are they going to decide to do the same thing, hoping that my community, which is 2/3 who tend not to also mail in their ballots, part of it's strategy too. So, and we're talking local elections that people do not pay attention to. If we were talking about the congressional races or a state race, and this is a question for November, this would be splashed across the front page of the Tribune, but because we're talking about the municipals, these are factors that political scientists talk about a lot, but people aren't really thinking about the same sorts of trends or the same sorts of potential problems for the municipals.
I have another question here. We've talked about corporate Democrats and professional women Democrats, and I'm sure there's radical Democrats too, whatever. We've talked about city Democrats versus suburban Democrats. Where do you see DuPage County blue? Is it light blue? Is it a more radical blue? Are things going to be, are we talking about bipartisan, or is it totally going to shift now blue?
I have a good answer, but I will let my co-panelists speak first.
Oh, okay, I could go first. I actually think that these elections always swing. Of course, I would say DuPage County is blue now, but I also believe that like these things always swing, and depending on the mood of the electorate, and for sure, like this year, the pandemic also played, I believe, like a large role in the vote, because people were concerned about the pandemic. There was high unemployment. There was no additional relief package put into place. And so that is certainly going to play a role in how people vote. But also, as Missy mentioned, the demographics are certainly changing in DuPage County. But at the same time, you lose by a couple hundred votes in an election where Donald Trump at the top of the ticket is losing by 14 or 15% in that same district. Most likely that won't happen in the next election. I mean, by the way, I'm terrible at guessing like what's going to happen in elections, but at the same time, we've gone through this pandemic with Governor Pritzker. I'm assuming that he'll probably run for re-election in 2022, and I would expect that there'd be some kickback to that what did he do to manage the pandemic, and what happened with our economy during the pandemic? And I would imagine that would also come from the top of the ticket and make its way down. Plus, of course, that Joe Biden would be in his midterm also. So I would say it's probably a light blue.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think DuPage is always, at least for the foreseeable future, is going to continue to have contested elections. I don't see one party rule in DuPage. What we do see in urban studies when we look at metro areas is if we were to draw circles around the city, like your first ring inner suburbs tend to vote more blue. Your middle suburbs still are tending blue, and exurbs tend to be a little more red. But one of the key factors that we're teasing out of the 2020 election is education and how much education matters. And Democrats have been quite successful. Used to have, white college graduates that were part of the Republican Party's base, but a majority of them are shifting to the Democratic Party. And this is, part of the distinction that we're seeing between the two parties. The parties have become very culturally, socially, distinct from one another. The Republican Party has become largely white, Christian, rural, slightly more male, and the Democratic Party is everybody else. So more importantly, I think there are questions about within both parties what happens, to their far progressive sides, their far conservative sides, and whether or not we're seeing a party realignment, particularly in the Republican Party. Like, where do your standard bearer, old school DuPage Republicans go, or is it continue to be a takeover of the Republican Party from, of Trumpism? So I think that's something to keep our eyes on as well.
Agree. I think DuPage is purple. I'm not even sure I go light blue. I think the closeness of so many of these races is the biggest indicator. If we look at the lines and we look at the data from the mid-1990s, we see slow trends upward, and that's about all we can say. But the fact that the seats are going back and forth, the 45th district, which is like Bloomingdale-Roselle area, went from Republican to Democrats to Republican. So, the effort matters by the candidate clearly, but that district, going back and forth means something. It matters that it's going back and forth. It means that the constituency is not settled. It's not even light blue over there. But then in the 41st, we saw that go from, a Republican to a Democrat. So we are pretty purple in DuPage, but I think as time goes on, as Bill and Connie have said, as time goes on, we will see more bluing, and we will see more, especially if Mike Madigan keeps drawing these Republican-proof maps. I think it's probably a sure thing. We'll see more Democrats in DuPage County. But if we're looking at the data alone, we see it changes incremental, right? Blue wave sounds great, but change is incremental. It's slowly but steadily changing as the demographic inversion is slowly but steadily marching itself outward towards, farther and farther out towards the suburbs.
Thank you. I think it's going to be very interesting actually to watch this and now how policy will change, if it does change at all. I guess, when you think about the suburbs and the exurbs and the city, things will be changing. But I think that the handwriting's on the wall for any politician. They have to listen to both sides of the aisle. They really have to work together and listen to their constituency. We have one more question. Hold on, I can't find it now. Here it is. So nice to have reasoned analysis. Thank you for your expertise. I like that question. It's answered already. Thank you very much. But I appreciate the time that we spent here. I appreciate the time that you've taken during finals week. Bill, Melissa, Connie, it's a tough time to be doing this, but the Electoral College finally met. We finally have things settling down. We don't have to, well, we're here, but we might not have to worry too much about Georgia. That's another story. But I do appreciate the time that you've been able to give us. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And thanks to the audience. Great questions, and you stuck around and listened and really wanted to share. We have a very engaged group here, and that's wonderful to see. The participation and the interest in the political process is very important, and we appreciate it. Please visit www.cod.edu/experts for a list of new webinars that we're planning for 2021. The spring semester is going to hold we're going to have webinars to deal with public health. It should be very interesting as well. Be safe, stay well, have a good holiday. Thank you again so much to our panelists, Bill Enright, Melissa Mouritsen, and Constance Mixon. And thank you again for joining us. You can check the recording out again at our website, cod.edu/experts, and on the COD playlist. Take care and good night.